I've always sort of worked in desert contexts, but for a really long time, I hadn't thought of them as political spaces. But once I started to see how these different desert connections were being formed, is that I could see how the very idea of the desert became a kind of currency for justifying and building these connections between these places. The American settlers in the building of the domestic empire, they saw the power of bringing the ideas from what they referred to as the old world deserts. The Americans figure out that it's useful to help them in their colonial enterprise at home, but then they also realize that it can help them in their imperial project internationally.
Welcome to an episode of the Afikra podcast. My name is Mikey Mhenna. Today on the series, I have with me Professor Natalie Koch, who's the author of Arid Empire, The Entangled Fates of Arizona and Arabia. Natalie, welcome to the series.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
Well, let's just start where most people are interested in. We'll probably have the first question. Arizona and Saudi Arabia do not seem related at all. Maybe let's explain why you wrote a book about Arizona and Saudi Arabia.
Sure. Well, the book is about broader connections beyond just Saudi Arabia, but between Arizona and all of the Arabian Peninsula. But it was actually the story of this Saudi dairy company, Al Marai, acquiring farms in Arizona in 2014 that first piqued my interest in this project. I grew up in Arizona, and I've been working in the Gulf countries for many years, since 2012, basically. And when I heard about this Saudi dairy farm getting set up in Arizona, I was totally shocked. Not only because growing up there, I just assumed, I had always heard that Arizona had this really bad past of growing these water-intensive crops, including alfalfa, which is what the farm is growing that the Saudis had acquired in 2014. And so I was really surprised that they were still growing these water-intensive crops in Arizona. And then, of all places, that a Saudi company would come to Arizona. It's quite far away, and seemed odd to me. So I got really interested in exploring exactly how and why that connection had materialized.
Yeah. Okay. Let's start where the book starts, which is the story of Hai Jolly. Just lay the groundwork about this story from 150 years ago.
Yeah. So Hai Jolly was a cameleer who came over to the United States in the mid-1800s. He was part of a bigger project of the U.S. government, which was interested in finding ways to help with the colonial expansion of the U.S. state into the West. So when Arizona and other parts of what we now know as the U.S. Southwest were added to the U.S. state, these were desert lands that nobody really knew how to manage. They were the U.S. government was really struggling to deal with them and to take control of them from the indigenous people as well as the Mexicans who had been living there before. So these were territories that were that the United States acquired after the U.S.-Mexico War.
This is just for people listening. So this is 1850s. So when you talk about the U.S. 1850s, what was the U.S. at the time?
It did not include California, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona. So all of those U.S. States that we now identify as mostly comprising the U.S. Southwest, those were not part of the U.S. state. So those were added at the end of the Mexican-American War. And then there was a few other slivers that got added a little bit later. So these were territories that really had just come under U.S. control. And of course, this was also a time when the U.S. state was still expanding west, and many of these lands were occupied by their indigenous inhabitants. So various Native American tribes were still there. There were some Mexican settlers that had come in from the Spanish colonial effort to take control of these lands, but there were not all that many of these people in the area. So the U.S. government, like they wanted to colonize these lands, but they didn't exactly have the manpower to do it, and they were also really struggling with this effort of getting people and supplies out to these military outposts. And so one of the challenges that they saw was that it took quite a lot of pack animals to move any supplies out there. And in addition, a lot of those pack animals that were traditionally being used in America as it was expanding, they demanded a lot of food. And so there were a number of people who were like these big proponents of the American expansion into the West, who they essentially believed that this problem could be overcome if the United States imported camels. There were a few people. George Perkins Marsh was one of them in particular. He's often sort of understood as this founder of the American environmentalist movement, but he was also a big advocate of American imperial expansion. He and several others had seen how the Ottomans actually used camels in war, because they had been like posted out in the east during these various conflicts, and so they had seen how camels were used, and so they thought that the U.S. empire could really benefit from trying to use camels for this expansionist effort. And so a number of people sort of advocated for and called for this camel experiment, which is what a lot of people think of it now. They might have heard of it as the Camel Corps, which is what the U.S. military referred to it as. And they essentially decided, Jefferson Davis, who was then Secretary of War, he was the person who sort of signed off on this and said, okay, go ahead, we can try this experiment with the camels. And they sent a ship, like a U.S. military ship, around the Middle East and Northern Africa to basically stop at a bunch of different ports to see whatever camels they could get on board. And they tried to get as many different types of camels as they could, but with the ultimate goal of bringing camels over to the United States to see if they could help in this expansionist project.
And how, I want to like come back to the character of Hajjali. Like, how did they find this person, who was the actual human? Yeah.
So one thing that these U.S. military guys saw pretty early on was that they did not know how to handle the camels at all. You need to know how to work with camels to get them to do what you want. And so they realized that they would need to start bringing some people from the places that they were visiting in order to manage the camels that were brought on board. And Hajjali was one of these people. His background, there's a lot of different ways that his background is framed, but people say that he was Syrian heritage, but he was from the Ottoman territories. Where precisely he was born, I don't think we know, but there is a general idea that he was a Syrian, and he came on board along with a couple other cameleers, and they then were like the first shipment of the camels was when he came, and this arrived in Texas, and so he became part of that first team in the first experiment to move those camels from Texas all the way to California. And very quickly, the U.S. Military people who were like involved in orchestrating this project, they saw that Hajjali Haji Ali, that he was kind of the only person that really knew how to handle the camels. The other people that they had brought actually didn't really know how to deal with the camels very well, and they were accused of just, trying to get a free transfer to the United States and to settle in the United States. But nonetheless, he became a favorite of the U.S. military folks who were involved in this project. And as you could see from the name there, Haji Ali is how he should be referred to, but the U.S. people referred to him as as Haj Ali, kind of just playing with the name or not understanding the name. I'm not entirely sure which. So he very quickly became a favorite character in this, and he also, like, after the project ended, so this went on for a couple of years of trying these different types of experiments with moving the camels across the US West, he eventually stayed and settled in Arizona. He married a woman from Tucson. He had a daughter, but eventually they separated, and he moved up to Quartzsite, Arizona, which is pretty close to the border with California, and he stayed there. He continued to work for the U.S. military, and also later became a mail deliverer. He was just in general part of this bigger project of helping with the American expansion in the state of Arizona, or what, at that time he lived in Arizona only when it was a territory. It only became a state in 1912, so this was still part of that, like, early development of the state.
Yeah. So let's go back to the reasons why you wrote the book. So if somebody like looks you up online, you'll see that you're described as being a geographer. What does that actually mean in 2025? What does it mean to be a geographer?
Well, there's kind of, I would say, generally three different types of geographers. Academic geographers, that there would be the people who work mostly on mapping, what we would call techniques. So all the sort of cartography and spatial mapping tools that geographers might use. And this is often what a lot of people think of when they think of geography, as essentially just working with maps. Then there are the geographers who do physical geography. So these would be people studying climate change, environmental issues, etc. And then there's a third group, which is where I would place myself, is in the subfield of human geography. And within that, we study all different types of human variation. There's many subfields within that, but I'm a political geographer. So that means I'm interested in many of the geographic features of state formation, of the global territorial system, of geopolitics, of identity politics. These are all questions that I've always been interested in. Geography as a field, like, a lot of people will choose to specialize in a topic, like me, political geography. But many of us also are really committed to empirical research. And so I've always considered myself to be one of those who's deeply interested in area studies. So when I was doing my dissertation research, I was focused mostly on Central Asia, actually. So I was working primarily in Kazakhstan, but the other former Soviet states in Central Asia. And so my specialization was in that region. It was only then by 2012 that I started to see a lot of connections between Central Asia and the Arabian Peninsula, that I started to work in the Arabian Peninsula and take that as my regional specialization. But from that early connection with Central Asia and the Arabian Peninsula, I started to think about the Gulf states in terms of their global connections, because this is something that I find absolutely fascinating. Is a big part of this Arizona book as well, is to look at those unexpected connections that actually really help to explain political processes. Many of the political geography questions that I'm studying in the Arabian Peninsula can be understood through those transnational connections that are not, the ones that you would usually think of. I'm thinking here in terms of all of the Indian Ocean connections between the Gulf states and their development.
What is it about this idea of, like, arid spaces, the deserts, being particularly misunderstood as a political space?
Yeah. So as I said, I used to work primarily in Central Asia, which are also deserts. And growing up in Arizona, I've always sort of worked in desert contexts, but for a really long time, I hadn't thought of them as political spaces. But once I started to see how these different desert connections were being formed, is that I could see how the very idea of the desert became a kind of currency for justifying and building these connections between these places. So what I could especially see in the case of the Arizona Arabian Peninsula connections is that these are really deep, long-lasting ties. So with the Hijali case on the Camels, you could see how the American settlers in the building of the domestic empire, they saw the power of bringing the ideas from what they referred to as the old world deserts to the United States. And so it was that idea that this new world desert could be built and developed through those knowledges and animals and eventually later also plants, that by bringing that, they could help colonize the New World desert. So some of these connections are really like long lasting, they're historical. But what I also found fascinating in all of these projects is that they sort of are on repeat. So in many of these cases, you see how they continue to reimagine what the desert is and how the desert becomes useful in building these political connections. So you have, as I mentioned, plants that come over. Arizona's first date palms. It became a really big thing to try and build a date palm industry in Arizona. Those first came from Oman. But then in 2018, the University of Arizona is brought to Oman to help with the Sultan's 1 million date palm initiative. So that what you often see in all of these cases that I'm looking at is this kind of toggling back and forth where the Americans figure out that it's useful to help them in their colonial enterprise at home, but then they also realize that it can help them in their imperial project internationally. And so it's that sort of imperial reading that I became really interested in this project.
So I'm like trying to understand. I've tried to ask this question 3 times. I keep on stopping myself before I do, but so far, like, what actually led to this idea of like, wait a second, there's a lot more to unpack aside from the just like the quirkiness of the back and forth. Like, oh, there's a Syrian cameleer in Arizona, how funny. Or, oh,
Mm.
like Arizona's bringing dates back and forth, and there's this interesting coincidence. Um, but where did the actual the there come where you're like, wait a second, there's a lot of stuff to unpack here, and I need to find, I need to get to the bottom of this.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was a slow accrual of different experiences, but more than anything, I would say it was a recognition that I hadn't been thinking of my own agency and as a descendant of the settler project in Arizona. I would say maybe there's one part of the book where I talk about encountering these photographs when I'm researching the Al Kharj farming project in Saudi Arabia. So this was a farm that Arizona farmers helped work on in the 1940s, and is kind of the home now of the Almarai Dairy Company. So this site is something that I had been looking at for some time, and I noticed in reading an article from the 1950s of a predecessor of mine at Syracuse University, a geography professor named George Babcock Cressy. He had visited Al Kharj in the 1950s, and he had slide photographs of the site. It was really extraordinary to go through his images and his materials related to his visit. but it was in that sort of shock of, okay, how is it that some professor in my current department at Syracuse Geography had been looking at this particular place? He's a white American who's going to the Arabian Peninsula just as I am this many years later. Am I just reproducing that old fashioned approach to geography of like sending white experts out to master these distant lands that forced me to think much more critically about my role as a scholar in working in the Arabian Peninsula? But not only that, because of the connections with Arizona and what I had already started to notice of all of these other white experts that were going and working in the Arabian Peninsula, that they were also using their background as having experience in the Arizona desert as a justification for them to go there and do that. And I was like, okay, I'm essentially doing the same thing. So the question for me became like, how do you reimagine that? How do you tell that story without just essentially re-entrenching that colonial drama that I was the inheritor of? How do I work through that complex political situation, and how do I challenge that in a meaningful way? I don't know that I always do it successfully, but it is something that I felt became like a personal project for me to understand my agency in telling these stories, and how it is that I could try to subvert or challenge some of these narratives and assumptions about, the colonial presence in Arizona today, as well as the American imperial presence in the Arabian Peninsula today. That they're interwoven. Yeah.
Yeah. How do people respond to this? Like when you talk about that idea, because obviously the Arabian Peninsula is filled with folks being brought in from all over the world to give expertise. I should say from all over the European and sort of North American world to come in and help give expertise about how to do things in this like very, very foreign environment. How do people respond to this?
So I actually, when I first started working in the Gulf states, I was rather overwhelmed by the amount of academic scholarship on the migrant populations of people coming primarily from South Asia and other parts of Asia. I was frustrated by this because, having spent some time already in the Gulf states, I could see that there were tons of other types of migrants, and specifically those white American and European experts who were there. So from essentially the beginning of my research efforts in the Arabian Peninsula, I had already decided that I wanted to focus on these white experts and to understand their role in these various projects, because I could see that they were working for the UAE government, for example. They were working for different consulting companies which were supporting these governments. So I always wanted to understand that, and I quickly started a project on American higher education in the Arabian Peninsula, where again you could see these same circuits of the white expert who comes there and is selling their credentials and their background in a particular way. So I knew from the beginning that was an important subject to raise attention to, because it just was getting short shrift. That when it's really easy for Americans to critique the authoritarian nature of the Emirati state, but they don't want to acknowledge it is the American citizens who are helping build that infrastructure. So that was always something that I wanted to bring forward, and I've tried to in all of my work raise that issue. And I think a lot of people understand that, and they see that, they feel that, even if they are part of it, and some of them they acknowledge it and they just say, okay, yeah, whatever it is, what it is. Others are more reluctant. They don't want to necessarily confront that history or that present. But it is also what I have seen in discussing this issue with Arizonans, as who I mentioned are, like me, descendants of that white colonial project of making Arizona a state. That these are the history of the colonization of Arizona is something that we weren't taught in schools. And I know that very well because I went to school there, right? But it is something that I think we really have an obligation to understand. When I first started working on some of the history of the University of Arizona in particular, I also started to work with a group of Native American students at the university who were trying to challenge some of the land grant problems associated with the history of the state. And what I could see in working with these Native American students is the fact that all of the labor and work about raising awareness about the colonial nature of the state today is put on them. And I can understand that impulse as a person who is part of that majority colonizing community, that we say, well, it's not our story to tell. Like, we don't want to colonize their story. But at the same time, that puts a huge amount of pressure and work on those people to be their own advocates at all times. And this is just so intensive. And so I realized that that's not okay. That if I am going to be part of supporting this awareness, then I also need to be speaking, and I can be speaking to those fellow descendants of the white settler culture. So that was essentially where I sort of felt that I could make a contribution in speaking specifically to those people. And I have to say, like, the reception in Arizona has been overwhelmingly positive, and I think to the extent that you raise that awareness and have a direct conversation with people as an in-group member, I personally feel that it's sometimes easier for some of those people to sort of put their guard down and understand and work through those issues together.
Yeah. It's interesting because, like, as you're talking, I was like, okay, no, I think I get it now. Like, basically, there is an illusion that that the sort of Westerners are going to come and teach the backwards Arabs, right? And there's going to be this, like, we are sophisticated and civilized. We will come and teach you rudimentary people who don't know how to manage living in the desert and technological advancements in the desert, right? Like the images of the Aramco engineers coming from Bechtel in San Francisco. We are going to be the ones to teach you how to do this and how to build a shining society, right? And we're going to, because we have experience in all facets, including life in the desert. Look at what we do in places like Arizona. But what your book does is it says, no. Actually, what ended up happening was that knowledge was actually brought over from the Arabian Peninsula,
Yes.
To help us.
Yeah, exactly. And I think what's so fascinating about this is precisely that the very inspiration for these diverse colonizing practices in the US Southwest, they came explicitly from this region. And it's not that they were hiding it, right? Like, in various newspaper articles at the time, it was named as such, using the old world desert knowledge to engineer this new
Natalie, can you give
utopian
an
future.
example?
Yeah, so you could see, especially this is a little bit further from the Arabian Peninsula, but a lot of references to the Nile. And this was often because Americans had such a limited knowledge of the Middle East in general, but they knew it from biblical stories. And so there was many references to the Nile in the Bible. And so people would take these stories about, the Nile and its fertile agricultural valley, et cetera, that this is how they should treat and approach the Colorado River. So Colorado River is the largest river and water source in the US Southwest. Tremendous river. And so there was this idea that all of those lessons about Nile cultivation practices could be brought to the US Southwest and treat the Nile or treat the Colorado River as the American Nile. And this idea is just one of various examples where they they could get the Americans to imagine this utopian future, which is full of, all of those lovely images in the Bible about these fertile lands and the blooming desert. So this story really helped people imagine that this was a future they could build for themselves in the region.
So these are like newspaper articles. Who is propagating this? Is this part of like
Yeah.
a federal initiative, a local initiative? Is it just like the milieu of the moment?
So
Who's invested in like that that propaganda?
yeah. So some of this is just in pure interest newspaper articles, but the biggest, well, there's a group of actors that I would call state boosters. And so these are essentially people who want the state of Arizona to become the territory of Arizona to become a state. So in this effort to get recognition as a state, the Arizona boosters, so these were like several big elite families within Arizona, they understood from Washington, D.C., various representatives and exchanges they had in Congress in the 1850s already, that the problem that DC saw with Arizona statehood is that it was not white enough. And so the boosters of the state felt, okay, well, we need to recruit more white settlers to come here. So this whole economy gets developed around getting immigrants from the East Coast, from the American East Coast, to move to Arizona. So these were immigration solicitors is what they were called, as well as Chamber of Commerce in the two larger cities at that time, which were Tucson and Phoenix. There were also just various city development councils, etc., who were all involved in this bigger project of trying to recruit these white settlers to come from the East Coast. There was also then the railroads. The railroad companies, Santa Fe, for example, like they had a huge interest in getting more business and developing the railroads further west. And so they were also ones involved in this project. And in all of these cases, these various boosters, immigration solicitors, the railroads, the chambers of commerce, etc., they produced hundreds and hundreds of these pamphlets that would circulate quite widely. And the pamphlets were essentially just selling the place and telling people that they could move here, that they could build this agricultural paradise in particular in Arizona, and like touting all of the benefits of this movement west. And this is something that the University of Arizona actually has this really excellent archive that you can actually view all of these archival materials of these various immigration solicitor documents, the urban boosters documents that show how these stories were being circulated. So it's a range of different outlets, but there's just a broader story about this.
Yeah. So it's interesting because like so much of the like mythology about America is tied to the story about the West.
Yeah.
And I mean, so many of us have watched countless Westerns, and it was, obviously one of the main outputs of Hollywood for a really, really long time as a genre, and as sort of, and remains really present in our sort of imagination about what America is.
Mm.
I don't remember there being Cameliers in any of these films. And I'm
There's
kind of curious.
one. There's one film. Yeah, it's called Humps. HAWMPS. So yeah, no, there usually are not camels in these.
Tell me about that
Yeah.
film. I'm so curious.
Oh, I don't talk about it in the book, but yeah, it's essentially the story of High Jolly, and it's pretty bad. It just is a caricature of the whole story,
It's like
essentially.
from
Yeah.
back then.
I mean, I can't remember what year it was made. I want to say maybe in the 60s. I'd have to look it up. But yeah, it's a Western style film, but yeah, there's very few references to it.
But like, I'm curious why that
Hmm.
didn't. I mean, maybe it's just sort of maybe it's racism, or maybe it was not a neat part of the story and it didn't fit into
Mhm.
the fantasy. But um, I'm curious if it was part of the imagination of America at some point, but it just didn't make the final edit.
Yeah. Yeah. So it actually it made the imagination in California in particular. I had to give myself very strict boundaries on this project to
Sure.
stay only focused on Arizona, but an equally fascinating story could be written about California. So in Indio, which is where they're also this is really became the home of the date industry. So as I mentioned, Arizona had already started to import date palms in the late 1800s. At the same time, you had the development of date groves in Southern California, and Indio became the home of this. India is also known for their date festival, and related to that, they have a whole theme related to the Arabian Nights. And there's a Queen Shevardnadze beauty pageant, and there are camels featuring very prominently in this. And so there's a broader history to this developing already in like the 1920s in the U.S. So yes, the camels do feature there. That story does feature there, but it's pretty confined, I would say, to Southern California and to Indio, this area, simply because it's part of like the local culture. In the broader sense of things, right? I think it simply doesn't fit with the broader story of the American West. That yes, occasionally in American Westerns you will see references to Chinese people, for example,
Yeah.
but other than that, there's usually a very standard set of characters that does not involve influence from the East. So there's a number of reasons for that, but it's pretty selective in its view. And I mean, in the grand scheme of things, the camel experiment was also relatively short-lived. The Americans hated the camels. Like there were a lot
Did
of
they?
reasons that yeah, they did. And there was even like one story that I read in some of these historical documents of one of these army people who got really mad about having to tend the camels and pushed his camel off a cliff. They just hated them. Yeah, they really did. So there was a lot of violence done to the animals, and the project as a whole was not received very well. And I think it's just largely because there's not a culture that is developed around camels, as you see in parts of the Middle East or even in Central Asia, where I used to work. They just aren't respected animals in the U.S., and they didn't really develop that niche from the beginning. Yeah.
It's interesting. So, like, going through the project, how has your impression of the Arab world changed, and
Mm.
how the desert sort of exists in our imagination?
Yeah.
Like, what can we learn from this story? Those of us who call this place home and are, have a specific have a specific version of what those places and spaces look like in our head.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's similar to what I learned about the Arizona desert as well. When I was growing up in Arizona, I always thought about the extent to which Arizona is international. It's simply because we share a border with Mexico. Like this is the extent of that international connection that I had really understood growing up, and I hadn't really reflected on in a broader sense. But what I learned through this project is really that it is much more global than we give it credit for. And so the way that Arizona as a place was developed, and all of its landscapes, like there still are date palms absolutely everywhere across Arizona, that there's so many ways that you can see that global presence and the connections between Arizona and the Middle East, that are completely missing from that popular story about how global it really is. And I would say the same for the deserts in the Middle East, that even when it feels like there is not a direct international connection, that in fact, when you look at those landscapes, they very much are. So going back to the case of Al-Kharj in Saudi Arabia, which is where the Al Marai Dairy Company is headquartered. There were American actors who came there in the 1940s who helped build up that farm, who introduced a number of new irrigation technologies, pumping technologies, et cetera, to develop that space. And so, yes, it is a space that is now controlled by a Saudi company, but at the same time, it has these deeper roots and that very story of water-intensive agriculture, including alfalfa in Saudi Arabia, which is, vastly depleted its water reserves. That was an American project. And when King Saud was crown prince, so when he was Crown Prince Saud Al Saud, like he visited Arizona in 1947, and he got this idea to bring back the dairy industry to Saudi Arabia. So he was traveling. All these ideas are traveling constantly. So there's tons of different ways that you have this internationalization of these global deserts that can get very quickly invisibilized. And I think that's to me what became so fascinating about this project is it's these connections are on repeat. They're not being reinvented anew. They're just a reimagination for the contemporary moment of how it is that you can reimagine the desert space. So I think for people who are living in these places, I think it's just to have a sense of curiosity about how is it that we normally think about these different agricultural practices or cultural references to the desert. When did that start? And is it really part of our native culture, or was it something that people imported somewhere along the way? That curiosity is really where I think people can just start with that. Maybe not a particular message per se.
When you were doing your research, at least in the Arabian Peninsula for this book, you say something at one point in the book, you say, my childhood romance with the desert was a political achievement. Do you feel as though people's relationship with the desert in your research in the Arab world, or at least in the Arabian Peninsula, also is like dripping with nostalgia? And is that nostalgia also a political achievement?
I would say it is, but it differs in the various countries. So in Arid Empire in the book, I don't speak specifically about Qatar, but I have done a lot of work there. When I see how the desert figures in like the nationalist story about Qatari identity, this is very different from how the desert features in nationalist stories about the desert in the UAE or in Saudi Arabia or in Oman. In all of these places, there's a different kind of nationalist story and history that is narrated along with the desert and the desert landscape. And this is something that continues to be a political achievement. So many of the other projects that I've worked on in the Gulf states look at different ideas about heritage and cultural practices related to camels, falconry, etc. So there is a certain romanticization of how that Bedouin past is connected with these traditional practices. So that shifts with time, right? And that is something that is always going to be a political achievement, just as it was for the Western films that I also grew up watching, helped me imagine the desert in a particular way. That this is something that we are always going to be imbibing as we move through these different landscapes and they feature in different cultural practices and norms.
Yeah. Okay, before we go, I'm curious if you can, I don't want to put you on the spot, but are there like a few other versions of that dairy farm story of you're like, this is a transnational project. This is a transnational project. This is a transnational project, because I don't, I'd love to be able to like, not to be, no pun intended, to like sort of map this out in my head where it's like, oh wow,
Hmm.
these are all around us. There's
Yeah.
so many examples of the way um, life and production from these
Hmm.
places is a intentional transnational like massive project.
Yeah. I mean, I think in the Gulf states, there's quite a few that come to mind. One which I haven't spoken about, but which I detail at length in the book, is the case of the Saadiyat Island in Abu Dhabi,
Yeah.
which now most people might know Saadiyat as it's the place where New York University Abu Dhabi is located. The Guggenheim is there, the Louvre is there. This particular island. The first developments on Saadiyat were actually an Arizona project. University of Arizona research team got sent there to build this big greenhouse operation connected with desalination, and
What
this
year?
project. Sorry.
What year?
They started in 1968 and it ran until 1974. Yeah, it's an absolutely fascinating story. But that imagination of Saadiyat as this location of Western experts coming to bring the cutting edge modern technology of the day, which at that point was this desalination and greenhouse initiative of growing vegetables in the desert, in desert dune sand. Um, that space has remained as such, right? As the home of NYU Abu Dhabi, as the home of Guggenheim and the Louvre. Like these are yes, they're museums, but they're also these engineering architectural marvels, which are tied to that imagination of Western experts and Western architects coming in with that cutting edge technology. So that space is a great example of how you have that sort of continuity between its first iteration and imagination and construction as such, getting shifted over time to the most modern iteration of that. As I mentioned, also in Oman, the University of Arizona has a project that they're still running there related to the 1 million date palm project, and helping, introduce a date research laboratory, et cetera, supporting a number of research initiatives to commercialize date palm production, which of course is like that's very counter to the way that dates are usually cultivated in Oman, but trying to introduce that real extractivist approach to agriculture in the space. And that broader idea of commercial agricultural production all across the Middle East, much of this has a deep connection with American empire and the selling of American expertise, already beginning in the 1940s in Saudi Arabia, but expanding well beyond in various spaces. Much of that was part of the American soft power project from the beginning. That as the formal traces of British Empire were evaporating, or French Empire in various places, or Ottoman Empire, that the Americans saw an opportunity to come in and develop these projects related to commercial agriculture. So when we think about that, you can look at farms, but I would also say one other important point here is that, like in Saudi Arabia, as I mentioned, they have really serious problems with their water supplies, like aquifer water. Yes, they have tons of desalination facilities, but the aquifer supplies have been massively depleted because of this commercial agriculture. So it's this broader configuration of that relationship between commercial exploitation for agriculture and natural resources that are needed to continue to live through these techniques and the building of U.S. empire. It has a much broader reach than just Air Force bases, military bases. Like, yes, that is part of it. But these ostensibly positive aspects of American empire, they have pernicious sides as well. So I think you can, once you start to see some of those transnational histories, you can trace them a little bit better.
It's so interesting. I mean, like, uh, to me, like the story of Abu Dhabi, I've never lived in Abu Dhabi. I don't just consider myself an expert on the history of Abu Dhabi, but I've been many times. Obviously, through the podcast, I speak to a lot of people who care um, about the history of the country. I've never heard the story of Saadiyat Island, nor have I
Yeah.
ever heard this quote, which is amazing, from Sheikh
Mm.
Zayed saying, do you remember the quote? Do you know which quote I'm going to say?
No, I don't. I'm not sure which one.
The quote is from 1967, give me agriculture and I give you civilization.
Mm, mm. Yeah, it's perfect in so many ways. And I mean, I was shocked when I first heard about it as well, and I was equally shocked that I couldn't find any information about it. Um, but what was, I would say, one of the best and most illuminating parts of the whole research process was the fact that much of the material that I found about this project was given to me by the UAE National Archives. So
Yeah.
they had a great holding. They were very, very helpful in finding this information. When I took that information back to the University of Arizona, they refused to help me. They were very insistent that they did not have any of these records or would not give me access to them.
Why?
And yeah, because I talk about this more in the book, and I'm a little bit quieter maybe than I would be otherwise, but they were involved in a lot of illegal activities. The University of Arizona was involved in a lot of illegal activities related to that project. And it was a really big mess. They ended up getting Sheikh Zayed really mad. He withheld money. The State Department had to get
Wow.
involved. It was a big mess. So there's really big political sensitivities around this, and the
Political
University of Arizona
sensitivities in
tried
the
to block
US
my
or locally
access
as
to
well?
this. Really, only in the U.S. It was the University of Arizona was the problem. So I was able to get some more records by going to the U.S. State Department archives in Washington D.C. or in College Park, rather. So I
Wow.
was able to get around some of these efforts to hide that information, but it came from the U.S. side, right? And
Can I
that
ask
history
you
is
what kind
something.
of
Yeah,
criminality are we talking about?
yeah. Yeah, so they they were misappropriating money, like the University of Arizona administration was misappropriating money from their general budget to fund the project that they were developing in Abu Dhabi, and this was something that became a really big problem. Also, when the leader of the project, Carl Hodges, he had promised Sheikh Zayed a state visit, like an official state visit, and this was in 1970, before the UAE was independent. This blew up into this really big fight. Hodges was trying to chase different people in the US government to try and get this visit. It didn't work. Sheikh Zayed got very mad, withheld the money. It was supposed to be like $3.4 million. And so for this reason, they were taking a number of administrative actions and misappropriating money that they shouldn't have been doing in order to compensate for that. It ended up getting resolved. The president of the university changed. Yeah, it was a big mess. But there's more about that in the in the book.
Amazing.
Yeah,
Um, so interesting. Natalie,
yeah,
thanks so much. This was really, really, really fun because we don't really get to talk about, first of all, we don't get to talk about agriculture that much.
yeah.
Do you have any other recommendations for people who are listening to this, like people who are interested in this type of like geography studies related to the Arab world? I mean, when we hear
Mhm.
about desert, a lot of time I hear about sort of like the desert in North Africa, in Morocco, and
Mm.
that being a major thing that people are concerned about and studying. But I don't know, I don't speak to a lot of geographers. What are some good books or things for people to look up?
Yeah, so there is one really good book that I would recommend to anyone who's interested in these transnational connections by Richard Garlitz is his name, and it specifically is about connections between Utah and Iran, also largely connected to agriculture. So it's a kind of parallel story, but the name of that book is called A Mission for Development, Utah Universities and the Point Four program in in Iran. So this is a great example of some of these transnational connections that you would be completely surprised by. Beyond that, in terms of other scholarship coming from geography, geographers don't usually write books. Some do, but not that often. So I don't know of any real geographers' books that spell out some of this history. But in the broader history of food in the region, I would also suggest Eckhard Würz's book. Würz it's Woertz, which is called Oil for Food. This is a fascinating, really well documented history of the development of the agriculture system in Saudi Arabia. The other book that I really like to recommend on these various issues is from Adam Hania, Money, Markets, and Monarchies. And he has also a really great chapter about the contemporary agricultural commodity circuits. So if those issues are of interest, I definitely recommend checking out that book as well. And of course, Toby Jones's book, Desert Kingdom, which is yet another excellent account of Saudi Arabia history.
Who was the last person?
Toby C. Jones, and the book is called Desert Kingdom, and it's also a broader history of oil and water, and thinking about the development of oil and water together in Saudi Arabia. And so, in both cases, with Toby's book on Desert Kingdom as well as Eckhard Würz's book on Oil for Food, they had referenced some of these Arizona connections in their footnotes, but that was all it was. And so that led me to really start trying to poke around and peel back some more to see if I could figure out what exactly that connection was. So sometimes reading the footnotes can help to bring you to a bigger project.
Amazing. We just had Adam Hania on the series, but we didn't get a chance to talk about money markets and monarchies that much because we talked about crude capitalism, but maybe I'll have him back soon.
Yeah, it's a great book. I definitely recommend it.
Okay, amazing. Okay, Natalie, thanks so much. This is really...
Yeah, thank you.
Should anybody look out for stuff that's coming out or find you? Where should they find you online?
They can find me on my personal website, which is just my first and last name together, nataliekoch.com. Cool. And yeah, there's links to everything there. If people want access to any of the research articles, I have everything posted on academia.edu and ResearchGate, but you're also welcome to send me an email and I can share a link to a big Dropbox folder. So
amazing. Okay, cool. Thanks so much.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it.